Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Harav, how are you?
Baruch Hashem, thank you. All right, good. Okay. Okay. So I think we're continuing the Bet Yosef here. So says Bet Yosef, "V'zeh lashon harosh beperet kama debetzah." This language of the Rosh, the first parak of Betzah. It says over there, "Al divrei Rav Huna v'Rav Chazda tzarich lizaher shelo ladun tavlin kedarkan, laduch tavlin kedarkan, hechad diyada mai kedera bae lebashule delo yadinan keman di ilchita ve'en olomar b'shel sofrim helech achar mekel." So says the Rosh, right, that regarding this issue that we spoke about, regarding grinding the spices, right, in the normal manner or in the abnormal manner. So regarding that, says the Rosh, we're not really sure what the halacha is, right? Is it like Rav Huna or Rav Chazda? So he says, therefore, we should be stringent, right? And this seems to be going like what we saw last time that we spoke about this according to Rabbeinu Tam. So Rabbeinu Tam seems to say, right, as we saw brought down on the tour, that you can only do this, right? You should know, like, if you know how much you have, you should do everything beforehand. And only if you don't know how much you have, so then we allow you to do it on Yom Tov itself. So the Rosh says, like, we don't also, right? Another thing he says here is that we can't say here that because it's a doubt regarding the rabbinical edict that we should go lenient. Why is that? Given that the more mekel b'chad tzad, because he says that they both have elements of leniency there, in a different way. So therefore, we can't really decide like one or the other just because we're going lenient as a general rule. So he says, shumin vadai mutarin naduch. But he says when it comes to garlic, for sure it's allowed to grind the garlic, right? To pound it, right? Kedarkan, like in the normal manner, he says, right? When it comes to the garlic, why? Because he says, right, that garlic spoils, quickly. So therefore, it's either like do or die, right? When it comes to garlic, okay, whatever, right? The truth is, nowadays, we see that garlic can last a long time. But what he's talking about here is that once you grind it, right, then it starts to already rot. Once you pound it, because once it's like it's whole, if it's still whole, it doesn't really rot, But once you grind it, then the process starts from there. That's what he means to say. So he says, therefore, right, when it comes to garlic, it's allowed. So is this according to the Ri, right? This Sheposek, K'Rav Huna or K'Rav Chazda. He paskins like both Rav Huna and Rav Chazda. V'chen dat Balamor. Also the Balamor says this. V'achita b'Yerushalmi. This is what it says in Yerushalmi. Rabbi Ameh b'Shem Rabbi Yochanan. Hashum ve'ashichlaim ve'achardal nidochin kedarkan. Right. So he says when it comes to garlic, right, and mustard, right, he says you can do it in the normal way to grind it on Yom Tov. Right. But he says when it comes to other things, no. Right, as we said. Ad kan that's the end of it. Right. Also, this is the way the two wrote in accordance with the Tosfot. So he says, but it seems like his words here are like sort of short, brief, right? A little bit brief on the brief side. Because according to Tosfot, he says, they paskin like Ravuna and Rav Chazda, lechumra, going stringent from both sides. Morika dino shavel melach. So says if that's the case, then the saffron would be the same as salt. The leolam bayes shinui that would require abnormal manner. Afilu lo yadam erev yom tov. Even if he didn't know erev yom tov, how many pots she wants to make, right? Whatever. Levashel, machar, tomorrow. How much she wants to do tomorrow. This is what it says in the Ran. B'shem HaTosfot, ubal ha'ma'or, the naktinan kechumra. They also say, right, that we go stringent here. That we go stringent from both sides of these two opinions. So therefore, it says, according to that, right, salt and saffron would require abnormal manner. Shinui, right? So this is also when it comes to all spices, if he knows how much spice he's going to need, how many pots he's making, how many dishes he's making, it also requires shinui. But if he didn't know how much he's making, then it doesn't really require shinui. Can do it in normal manner. That's the end of his words there. So he says when it comes to the Rosh, they didn't write. He didn't mention this element. That according to this opinion, you have to be careful not to pound also right when it comes to grind the saffron. Below shinui without a differentiation. Even if he doesn't know how many pots he needs to cook, right? So he says, you learn that from the garlic. Why? Because since he wrote the practical difference between them is morika, which is the saffron. And then afterwards he writes that if he knows how many pots he needs to cook, so then you have to be careful, right, not to do it in a normal way on Yom Tov. Right, so he says, you know why? Because we don't really know the halacha, which opinion it goes according to. So therefore, right, implies that saffron requires a different way, right? Alternative way, abnormal manner. Leolam deha forever. In other words, always. Deha lo yadinan kama hilchatan. Says we don't know keman hilchata. We don't know which opinion goes like. So we go stringent, right? V'kakatav Rabbeinu Yerucham. That's what it says on Rabbeinu Yerucham. If he knows how many pots he needs to make, right? Ename morika asur. Right, even so, then, right, even saffron, right, is forbidden to. Alternatively, saffron is forbidden to do in the normal way. So it says that we have to make a deduction here, deduce from the tour, according to Tosfot, they hold that we don't pass like Rabbi Yehuda. Because he said, right, you do everything the normal way. Vafilu melach, even salt, according to him. Like it says in the Braita there, ela kerav huna, ukerav chasda, the mefarshe tamar, the matnitin, the matzich shinui b'melach. So he says, right, that it's like Rabbunan Rav Chasda, that they say that you require differentiation when abnormal one manner when it comes to salt. Imken me'achar shedematnitin katane delebet hilel melach nidoch b'madoch. So if so, right, since the Mishnah says that according to Bet Hillel, right, you can do salt in a mortar which is made out of wood, mashma, so then it implies that dafka b'shel etz sharu, right, Bet Hillel. So that implies that that Bet Hillel allows doing it with wood, right, shehu shinui gadol, which is like already a very abnormal manner, right. About b'shel even, but he says when it comes to stone, right, using a stone mortar, right, afilu alidei hataya lo, you can't even do it by tilting. Shehu shinui azuta, because that's like a small shinui. So from the Torah, it implies, he says, the gam shitat tasvot melach be'ataya sagila. That according to Tasvot, right, it's enough just to do tilting, to tilt the mortar, b'madoch shel even, even if you're using stone mortar. So it seems to be that he holds that when it comes to using the wooden mortar, right, because it's a shinui, you don't really need to do tilted. So it's equal to like tilting it with a stone. So in other words, they're both like shinui, One is that you're using wood, that's one shinui. And the other shinui, alternatively, is that you're tilting it. So according to this opinion, he says they're both equal, in terms of the severity of the shinui, whatever, right? Okay. So it says, right, Bet Hillel goes like one of these, abnormal things, right? He doesn't require both. So right, that's what he says according to these rabbis, they paskin, right? That one is enough. You don't need both. So it says you have to say that he holds like the Tana of our Mishnah. That he says, right, that according to Bet Hillel, you have to use a wooden one, right, which is also a shinui in itself, because you're not using stone, right? Yeah, that's the thing. Okay. That's even without tilting, right? So you learn from there. So same thing will also apply to a mortar, right, which is used made of stone. If you tilt it, right, that's also shinui by tilting it. But it says whereas the Tana of the Braita, afilu melach madoch shel even ba'el hataya. So it says if you're doing the salt in a mortar of stone, you don't really need to tilt it according to that opinion. So okay, here we go. Right now, let's get ready for the punchline. Right, this is not a joke, but obviously, right, I'm joking, but whatever. You get the point. It's conclusion, right? Conclusion. It's a conclusion. So it says, what's the halakha? Bottom line, right? We saw here several different opinions. Right? So what's halacha? So it says, Kevan she'arif ve'arambam ve'arashba maskimim midat echad hachin aktina. Right? This is what I told you guys last week, that since, right, we have here on the one side, in the same side, the Rambam and the Rif and the Rashba, right? That's for the halachas like that. So what does that mean? We don't go like the Rosh and the Tosfot. Right? But don't be surprised, right? In the Shulchan Aruch, if you find that the Ramah paskins like the Rosh and the Tosfot, I wouldn't be surprised. We'll see how that goes, right? We'll see how that is. Katav Agaot Maimoniot. So says that this rabbi, Gimel B'Shem Samak, it says the name of the Samak. העולם נוהגים כשדחים תבלין במדוך לעשות קצת הטיה או שינוי אחר, ותמה דמתוך כך יהיו זכורים שעשו לדוך יותר מהצריך ליום טוב. So he says, right, there's a custom like this to be stringent. What's the custom? He says, that we tilt it a little bit, the mortar. Why is that? To display that, you can only do what you need on Yom Tov, right? Not more than that, So it's like a display of caution, right? By doing that, by tilting it a little bit. That's the idea, right? Katav. So we'll see in the Shulchan Aruch, right? If we need to do that. I think that the Shulchan Aruch Paskin is not like that. If I remember correctly, Katav says the Ran, בשם ירושלמי, אני ירושלמי, דמותר לשחוק קונדיטון ביום טוב, ולא ידעתי למה הוא צריך לכתוב כן, שהרי כפר פסק בריף, כל תבלין דוחים כדרכה, ומה לי לקדרה, מה לי לקונדיטון. Right, so he says, right, that he brings here, right, this leniency here, whatever, it's permission that you're allowed to grind to make conditon, right? So what is conditon? It's like a potion that, they used to drink, for health reasons, whatever, all kinds of stuff, for healing, whatever, right? Something like that, right? So he says, I don't know why he needed to write this, because we already said, right, every spice can be pounded in a normal manner according to the riff, right? So he says, what do I care if it's a dish, or it's conditon, right? This potion, what difference does it make? So now he tries to answer that, right? So he says it could be, the reason is because for the conditon, right, you may have thought to say that the spices don't lose their flavor, right, for the sake of this potion. So therefore it's not really a problem. So you may have thought that we should be stringent regarding conditon. So comes and tells you, right, that you can be also lenient with conditon. So what does that mean? You could do everything in the normal manner, right? Most of the spices, as we said, right, except the salt. Okay, so let's see, right, where that goes. Katava Kolbo says Kolbo Gargir Shekorin Aroga. Right, so he says there's something called aroga. It's some kind of a asur la'asota b'yom tov lefi she'asuya mi'be'arev tova. Right. So he says because it's made from. I don't know what he means by this. Probably means that it's like made before Yom Tov. Okay, we'll see what that means. I'm not really sure. The language is a little bit unclear. There's something here, maybe explains it. Let me just see if he explains this here. Let's see. Right, so he brings here the Ramah from Darkei Moshe that says that if you do it with a shinu, it's okay, right? In this case. Okay. But it still doesn't explain exactly the whole thing here. What the meaning of this is. Okay, I'll read it one more time. So it says like this: Katalakovo shagargir shekorin aruga. Right. So he says there's a certain thing which is called aruga, some kind of substance. All right, and you're not allowed to make it on Yom Tov. Lefi she'asuya mi be'erev tova. Not exactly sure what that means. Okay. Anyway, Katava Rivash shenishal im mutar ligrod. הגבינה בכלי שהוא מורג חרוץ, בעל פיפיות וישיב ונראה. Right, so now a very practical question comes up here, right? The question is like this. I've been asked this question, by the way, by people. In fact, a rabbi asked me this question one time. So the question is like this, right? Are you allowed to grate cheese, right, on Yom Tov? Because you're grinding, it's like grating is grinding, same thing. You're making like very small pieces there.
Does it matter whether it's tastes
right?
better when it's fresh?
I'm sorry, what was it again?
Does it matter if it tastes better when it's ground fresh?
Yeah, I mean the truth is that we'll see how it goes, right? But I can tell you one thing, right? On Shabbat this is forbidden. The grate cheese. Because of the prohibition of grinding. So now, right, let's see regarding, right, what the din is regarding Yom Tov. והשיב דניאל שצריך לעשות, שהוא מורג לעשות איזה שינוי, דומיה דמלח. So he says, do a שינוי with that, right? Just like you do with salt, he says. דהרי אם היה עושה מערב יום טוב, לא היה מפיק זרמה. So this is what he answers your question, right? He says it doesn't really spoil the tastes to grate it, the day before. Do you accept that, Shoshana? Okay.
I mean,
You're the expert. I don't know.
Jewish, but as far as being Italian, maybe not so much.
Okay. Well, all right. That's interesting. So it says, right, But he says, oh, so here you go, right? That's exactly what it's saying. So if it's something which, the taste will, get deteriorate, so then he says you could do without a shinui, right? Exactly what you're saying. Yeah. So if you know your stuff, right, then you know what deteriorates and what doesn't deteriorate. You can go by that rule, right? But it seems like he's saying in general, the cheese will not deteriorate. Just because you did it the day before. Okay, interesting. All right, that's the end of it. So let's see Shulchan Aruch, right? Taf Kuf Daled Aleph. Okay. All right. Good. This one. Maybe I have to bring it up because it's a new chapter here. Could be that I never brought it up. Yeah, I guess so. I guess I didn't. I don't see it. All right. So I guess I got to bring it up. Let's try that. See what we got here. Right. So it says in the Shulchan Aruch like this. Dachinet tavlin kedarkan, right? So you can see right away, right? Paskin's like the Rif and the Rambam and the Dara and the Rashba. He says, right, you can do spices in the normal manner, to pound them, right? Whatever. So what's the reason why? Because if you do it the day before, right, the taste will already deteriorate, right? So it's not the same thing. אבל מלח אינו נידוח בערב יום טוב, ביום טוב, אלא אם כן היטה מכתש או שידוך בקערה וכיוצא בו, right? So it says, when it comes to salt though, right, as we said, right, since it doesn't deteriorate, so therefore the rule is you got to do shinui, right? So what is the shinui over here? Tilt it, right? Tilt the mortar, right? Or alternatively, you can also, right, use some kind of different device, right? As we said, right, use a wooden one or use right, some kind of a tray instead of a mortar. Do a shinui. Because he says, what's okay? So again, we said it already, but he says, right, the reason is because the salt will not deteriorate, right? That's for sure. Okay. ואין שוחקים את הפלפלים ולא את החרדל בריחיים שלהם. So he says, when it comes to, right, pepper, right, and mustard, so we shouldn't do it in a normal manner, right, in a mill, like, Why is that? Mishum tehave ke'ubdin dechol. So what's the reason why? Because it looks like weekday activity, right? So what does that mean here, right? What's the pshat? What that means is that you're doing it like, in a way which it's done like in a massive way, right? In other words, in terms of quantity, you're doing it in like a very, very weekday manner. So what you got to do is use something, right, which is going to give you like a low yield, right? Not like a massive kind of a quantity, right? So therefore, use something which is going to be a little bit, right, more limited. That's the idea. So don't use like the regular mill, right, that they usually use, right? Today, I know we don't have these things that they had in those days. I mean, these utensils. We have other things, whatever, right? So, but it seems like if you're using like some kind of a household, thing, which doesn't do like a large quantities, you're good. That's fine. You're not using some kind of industrial kind of thing, right? That's what we're talking about. So what do you do? He says, right, with these things, use like a mortar, like any other, any other spice. Use a mortar instead. Don't use a mill, right? Mill is like professional, industrial. That's the whole thing. Okay, that's good to know, right? So now, pretty much we see, right, that the Shulchan Aruch is lenient here, except when it comes to salt, right? Salt requires shinui. We don't do that today anyway, so right? Well, it is what it is, right? So says Ramah here, right? But he says the custom is to do a little bit of a shinui, right? As the Beit Yosef mentioned. So the Ramah, as we said, right? As I told you guys, don't be surprised if the Ramah is going to argue here, right? So he does argue. So according to Shulchan Aruch, you don't need any shinui for spices, right? You can do it in the normal manner, but not the industrial manner, right? That we don't want. Right? On a mass scale kind of manner, But says the Ramah, the custom is to be a little bit stringent. So what does that mean? Do a little shinui, right? So what does that mean, little shinui? Tilt it, whatever, right? Do some tilting, tilt it, whatever. Right? Be lopsided, So that's good enough. That's what he says, right? The Ramah, and we saw that in Bet Yosef. But Maran, didn't pass in that way, but the Ramah does. So it's not such a big difference either way, You're pretty much free to do what you want, pretty more or less. Tilting it is not a big deal, it's not a big deal. So either way, you're good. Okay, good. Baruch Hashem. So let's see if we can knock off another one. B'lei neder. Let's back to Bet Yosef tour. So we'll read the tour first. Okay. Right, okay. Right, so it says the tour like this. מותר להוליך תבלין ומדוך אצל הקדרה, או הקדרה אצלם. Oh, so interesting, right? He says you're allowed to take the spice, right? And also the mortar towards the pot, right? Or the pot towards them. You're allowed to carry one to the other, right? So what's the big deal, right? What are we talking about here, right? So we're probably talking about the laws of muktzah here, whatever. Let's see. In the Beit Yosef, how he explains this. So says Beit Yosef, Per Kama de Betza. What's the source for this? In Betza, Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, Bet Shemai Omrim, En Molechin Tavlin Maduch Etzel Meducha, Velo Meducha Etzel Tavlin Maduch Bet Hillel. Right, so Bet Hillel forbids this, right? To take one to the other. Interesting, right? And Bet Hillel Matirin, right? Bet Hillel allows us. Umfaresh Begimara, so explains in Gemara, Tama de Bet Shemai, de Chayeshe Dilma Ate Leamluche, Shelo Levashel Kedara de Baya, תבלין ונמצא שטרח שלא לצורך הוא בית הלל לא שייך לאחי. So he says right like this that the reason why Bet Shammai says you're not allowed to do this is because you may realize that you don't really need it, so like you did like exertion for no reason, right? Okay, and he says Bet Hillel is not concerned about this, right? He doesn't care. Rashi explains Madoch, right? What is the mortar? Buchna shedachin bo tavlin u'meducha. Rabbeinu katav kedera b'makom meducha. So right, Rabbeinu the Tur he says he writes the word kedera, which is a pot, instead of the mortar. It could be that his text was like that. Or the lo chashash milachaliv ze b'zeh, or he didn't really care, right? He thought they were the same. It doesn't really matter. Kivan shedinam shabeh. Why? Because the halacha is the same by both of them. When you add afilu derech reshut darabim sharei leolich tzeh. So says right the Shulchan Aruch, you can even carry this outside, right, in the street, no problem. The mortar, the spices, right, all that stuff, right, the pot. Etzel zeh kimo shkatav Ran, like the Ran says, bedin olachat sakin v'tabach etzel abehema. The same thing applies also, like if you're taking the knife, right, to slaughter, you can take one to the other, right? Carry the knife to the animal, right, or the other way around. So he said that's going to explain the different chapter, right, regarding the issue of slaughter, right? But when it comes to, as we said, our case, right, which is talking about the spices, you can carry one to the other. So in other words, what are we talking about here? We're not talking about din of muktzeh. We're talking about din of exertion, right? Unnecessary exertion. That's what it's all about. Okay, good. So let's see Shulchan Aruch here. Let's see the Shulchan Aruch. Pretty straightforward. So it says, right, as we said, right, you're allowed to take one to the other. Or meducha etzlam, right? In other words, what does that mean? The mortar to the pot, the spices, right? You can carry all that stuff around. Even if you're going the street. No problem, right? As we said, on Yom Tov, you don't really need an eruv, to carry this stuff. Like you need it on Shabbat. On Shabbat, you don't have an eruv, you can't carry nothing outside in the street. So you got to be careful with that. That's why it pays to live in a Jewish neighborhood, right? Because there you have an eruv, if it's a decent neighborhood, right? With some kind of a, rabbinic body that takes care of these things. So then you have, an eruv. But if you don't have an eruv on Shabbat, can't carry nothing outside. But but on Yom Tov doesn't require eruv, so therefore, right, you can carry the stuff without any eruv, no problem. So it says in Shulchan Aruch, even if it was possible to do this before Yom Tov, right, to carry this stuff, you can still do it on Yom Tov. So why is that? As we said, right, Bet Hillel they're not really concerned about this. What does that mean they're not concerned? They're not concerned that you may change your mind and then not use it, and it comes out you did like exertion for nothing, right? They don't care about that. It's a remote possibility, And it's also a rabbinic prohibition, so we don't have to go crazy. That's the story. Okay, so if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll go on. Okay, pretty straightforward. Okay. Let's go to the next piece. So it says the Tur here, En korchin harifot v'kiltze b'zeh b'machteshet gedola. Right, so if you want to, as we said, right, if you want to pound, right, harifot, right, we'll see what that is, right, in a second, but hopefully, B'ezrat Hashem. But it says, don't do it in a big mortar. Do it a small one, right? So it's in a place where there's concern, they're going to use a big one, and they're going to say, oh, we didn't use the small one. You're not even allowed to use a small one. That's the case. So people who cheat. So he says, since we don't really know what's called large and what's called small. We don't have like a size for this, right? We don't know. We don't have a tradition for that. So he says, therefore, it's proper to be stringent and forbid every kind of of this kind of thing. Okay, so good. That's Gimel. So let's see, Bet Yosef, how he explains this, right? Let's see what he says. So Bet Yosef says, right? What's the source for this? Sham Tam Rabbanan, right? He brings the Braita there, right? In Yud Dal Amud Aleph in Betza. En osin tisni ve'en kotshim b'machteshet umfarshim tachi kamar. My tam en osin tisni lefi she'en kotshim b'machteshet. So he says you cannot make this food which is called tisni. Why is that? Because you're not allowed to pound in the mortar, right? So they explain the Gemara. What does that mean? That the reason why you can't make tisni is because you have to pound the mortar. So okay. How about Amina? You may have thought it's only a large one, but a small one's good. It's allowed. Kamashman comes to teach you that they're not so, right? So we learned over there in the Braita that you can use you can use a small one, but not a large one. Rashi explains ha lan de letlan of the mezalzele. Right, so we don't have like these slaves, who do like tricks with this and trick us, using the wrong one, using the large one instead of the small one. Ha leu, that's for them. They eat leu after the mizalzele. They have slaves, that the ones who do have slaves that cheat. Right, so then we have to be careful, not even to do a small one. So what does that mean? Those slaves, right? What they do is they say that we use a small one, but really they use the big one. So what do we see from here, right? The bottom line is like this: don't use a large mortar, right? Because that's like, as we said, it's like, you're using industrial kind of a method here, right? A large mortar, which is like weak to activity. So the Rambam Katav says, the Rambam, פרק ג' אין קודשין את הריפות ממחצשת גדולה, אבל קודשין ממחצשת קטנה, שזהו השינוי שלה, ובארץ ישראל אפילו מקטנה אסור שהתבואה שלהם טובה היא, ואם קודשין אותה מערב יום טוב, אין בכך הפסד, ולפי דבריו, בתבואה חוץ לארץ, שאינה יפה, אף אגב דאיקה עבדי שרה, so he says, right, that the Rambam brings here the halakha. So what does he say, right? That we shouldn't, as we said, right, use the large mortar, but a small one you can use. But he says, when it comes to Eretz Israel, over there, you can't even use a small one. So why is that? So he says the reason is because there, the grain over there that grows in Eretz Israel, it's very high quality. So in other words, you don't need it. You can do it the day before, and it won't, right? The taste will not deteriorate of the harifot, right? Which is some kind of a grain, apparently, right? That's what it is. Talking about grains. So what do you see from there? We're not talking about spices, right? Because regarding spices, we already discussed that issue. Here we're talking about, grains here. So, right, that's the story. And but it says, according to Rambam, it comes out, right, that when it comes to outside of Israel, where the grains are not so good like that, like Israel, even if they're right, even if they there are people who do that, it's still allowed. When it comes to the Rif, though, so it says, it implies from his words that they have slaves over there, it's forbidden. Because as we said, right, those slaves, they cheat, they lie. איקלה לבית מור שמואל, אייתו לדייסה, ולא אכיל ודילמה, במחצשת קטנה עבדוה, חזיה, תהבה דייק תפה, ודילמה, מאתמול עבדוה חזיה, Hazia Diaba Caliph de Siare, Utefe, Vei Baitema, Shani, be Barshmul, Dika Peritsuta, Dabde Alma, the Swile, the Hecha, Dika Avde, Hashin and Shema Yesh Lechalek, Ben Hecha Dika Satam Avde, or Lecha Dika Peritsuta, Dabde. Okay, so, right, let me just recap that, right? What is he saying here? He's saying like this, right? That as we said, we're talking about the issue of pounding grains, right? So just to recap, right, this whole thing, what are we learning here? That you can't use a large one, as we said, right? Large mortar for this purpose, because it's like industrial, whatever, right? So therefore, we want you to use a small one. But in a place where, there's concern about these slaves who cheat, right? Whatever, and they lie, they misrepresent, right, what's going on. So there we have to, right, put our foot down and forbid even the small ones because they cheat. Okay, today we don't have that problem, right? So we're okay with that. We don't have slavery today. We abolished slavery, right? So we have no problem with that. So right, so it seems like you could do a small one, So what are we learning from here, practically speaking, right? That if a person wants to pound grains, right? So he says, right, what's the purpose of that? They wanted to make daisa, right? What is daisa? Like porridge, they make porridge. So the right, if you want to do that and pound it, right, use a small one, use a small mortar. Don't use a large one. Okay. כתב רב מגיד בהשגות, so it says רב מגיד, so it says that it says in the Ravad, right? Omer Abraham, right? Says Abraham, and Atat Nocha Mizeh, says, I don't agree with this, with the Rambam. He doesn't agree with the Rambam. The Atam, Aval Ansh, so I don't agree with the reasoning of the Rambam. Aval Anshe Eretz Yisrael, Dai Lahem, Kol Yemehem, Biktana, Ve'en Lahem B'shinui, Aval Anshe Bavel, Ikar Tavshinam, B'daisa, Sheochlin Ba, Alechem, והיו עושים אותה במרתשת גדולה, או מרתשת קטנה היא להם שינוי. לפי דבריו, כל מקום שאין רגילים הרבה בדייסה, הרי הוא כארץ ישראל, ולזה הסכים הרשב"א ז"ל, ודת רבנו כדת הלכות, ואין באחד מן הפירושים הכרח עד כאן לשונו. Right, so he brings here that the Ravad argues with the Rambam here, and he's stringent a little bit, right, when it comes to the issue of even using the small mortar. So he says in Eretz Israel you can't use a small mortar, and he says, but he brings a different reason for that, not because of the slaves. He says the reason is because over there in Eretz Israel, it's not considered to be a shinui at all. Right? That's the normal way of doing it there. So therefore, it's forbidden. So he says the Rashba seems to agree with this. But that Rabbeinu kadat halachot. So he says the Rabbeinu goes like the halachot. Right? In other words, he means to say that the Rambam is going like the halachot. Then be'echad min al-perushim echrach. He says, I don't know. He says, I don't know which one's halacha. In other words, they're both good. Both opinions are good. Okay, well, we'll see what that means, right? Shulchan Aruch will see what the halacha is. So then he goes on. So then he brings right what the Torah said, that we don't know nowadays what's big and what's small, when it comes to the mortar. So what do we do? And so says the Torah, as we said, you should be stringent and not use it at all. Hem divrei atzmo, right? Says that's his own opinion. So in other words, not everybody agrees with that, right? You should be so stringent like that. Okay, we'll see the Shulchan Aruch, right? What's going on? Okay. We will see. We shall see. All right. So says Shulchan Aruch, en kodshin harifot b'machzesh gdola, right? As we said, if you're pounding grains, to make porridge, whatever, right? Don't use a large mortar, because we want you to do a shinui, right? Use a small one, something like that. Aval kodshin b'machzesh ktana, but it says we're allowed to use a small one. Shezehu a shinui yashela, because that's a shinui, right? Using a small one is a shinui. So you see from there, by the way, the fact that we require a shinui, that means that, grinding it from yesterday, the day before, will not really, deteriorate the taste. So that's why you need a shinui, obviously. Otherwise, it will be normal. It will be permitted in the normal manner, just like we said with the spices. Right. So he says, when it comes to Eretz Israel, even a small one is forbidden, right? So since we don't know what's big and what's small, so it says therefore we forbid it all, right? So we don't allow you to grind, right, grains on Yom Tov. So you see, right? The spices we do allow. When it comes to grains, we don't allow. Right. So, what's the reason why? Because, as we said, right, you could have done it yesterday. So that's the reason why. Okay, it's interesting, but the truth is, that I can tell you one thing: that if you do a different kind of a shinui, then it could be that it's allowed. In other words, this shinui is not good enough. Using a small mortar is not good enough, right? But there may be other types of shinui which are good enough. And also, I have to tell you another thing, which is that in Eretz Israel today, right, the custom to do things in Eretz Israel today is not what they had 500 years ago. So it could be that nowadays Eretz Israel and the rest of the world are the same when it comes to this. So. But here's the thing, right? It doesn't really matter. Why? Because we don't really know what's big and what's small, right? As like the Torah said. So therefore, we forbid everything. We don't know what's big and what's small. Okay, interesting. Okay. As I said, there may be room to be lenient, if you're doing another shinoi. But the truth is, who does this today, right? Who grinds grains today, right? So you don't really need it. It's not necessary, So better to be stringent with this. And no reason to be lenient, really. Today, we don't do these kinds of things. We don't grind grains, whatever. We don't do that. We buy everything ready-made. And that's the way it is. So it's not really so relevant anyway. So it says here the Ramah, Haga, right? Umutar ligor gvina b'yom tov al-kli shehu murag hacharutz. Miu tzarich shinui me'at, right? So he brings the issue of to grating the cheese, right? So he says you're allowed to grate the cheese, as we said, right? But you got to do shinui, right? So what is a shinui? Kemo dichat melach, right? Just like with the salt, right? So as we said, right, with the salt, use like some kind of abnormal method, right? Whatever. As we said, right, you could tilt it. והוא הדין מצווה בלא שינוי, משום דאין תחינה באוכלים שהיו תכונין תחילה. So it's the same thing also applies when it comes to matzot. Right? Because you could have done this before. So, okay, so let's summarize this so we got it straight. When it comes to pounding grains, right, it's not the same as pounding spices. Spices were lenient because the taste, deteriorates. But when it comes to these things, since the taste does not deteriorate, these kinds of things, so we have to be stringent. So what does that mean to be stringent? When it comes to grains, just leave it, right? Don't do it in Yom Tov. Probably the best thing to do, right? If you really have a pressing case, so you could do some kind of a shinui, right? Maybe to tilt it or something or whatever, or to right, or to use some kind of alternative kind of method. Do it in a right, as we said, do it in a tray instead of doing it in a mortar. That would be probably good enough. As we said, it's not so practical. So comes the Raman tells you also when it comes to grating cheese, right? As we saw in the Beit Yosef, same thing, right? That you should do a shinui there. But when it comes to Shabbat, there we don't allow it at all, right? Forget about that. So don't grate cheese on Shabbat. Forget about that, right? Nothing to talk about. Only on Yom Tov we allow that. So if you want to make your cheese things, right, whatever on Shabbat, right? Grate cheese. You want to make a salad, whatever it is, right? So grate it before Shabbat, right? Make sure you do that. Okay. So right. So then, right again, he talks about here. Okay, I guess that's pretty much a story there. So hopefully we got the whole thing here. So we have one more halacha here.
These halachot apply to Yom Tov, not necessarily Home Wed, right?
Yeah, Chol Hamoed, by the way, we're going to get to that, Bezat Hashem, right?
Okay.
One day, billionaire there, right? But the truth is, right, Chol Hamoed is a totally different story.
Okay, thank you.
We're much more lenient on Chol Hamoed than we are on Yom Tov. You know what I mean? And I'll explain to you why that is, by the way. Because on Chol Hamoed, it's not like Shabbat at all, right? As we said, Yom Tov and Shabbat are almost equal, right? When it comes to Chol Hamoed, it's not equal to Shabbat or Yom Tov at all. So, according to the Torah, you're allowed to do any labor on Chol Hamoed. But the rabbis decreed on certain things, you shouldn't do because of extra exertion, things like this, right? So, that's a totally different story there. So, grating cheese on Chol Hamoed, right? That's for sure allowed, no question about that, right? Well, there's nothing to talk about. Or grating, right, or pounding, some grains. No problem with that. No. To make some porridge, whatever it is, right? But we don't want you doing industrial stuff, on Chol Hamoed, large scale industrial things, or professional things, things like that. That's the general idea of Chol Hamoed. Okay, we'll get to that, Brother Hashem. One day we'll get there. So, okay, so we have here one more. You want to do this? It's a small one. It's up to you. To finish the chapter, I guess we can do it. I'm gonna hold you up, because yesterday I wasn't here, so gotta do some makeup. You deserve a makeup. Okay. So let's see what we got here. Very, very, very simple, very straightforward here. Well, first we'll see the Tur, right? What does the Tur say? It says, right, Asur limdod tavlin kedei litnam b'kederal v'nechtom b'motar kedei shelo yakdiach tavshilo, right? So it says, so this is a very practical thing, right? That, okay, so we allowed you, as we said, to pound the spices, no problem. But don't measure it, right? Don't do an exact measure of the spices. So what does that mean? Do like approximation. Take it with your hand, whatever. Or use like a cup or something, but not a cup which has like a measuring cup. Don't use those. You know what I mean?
What if that is your normal way of doing things?
What, measuring cup?
Just measuring with your hands.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. Because that's not really called measuring.
Okay.
I mean, I know, I know from experience that like the ladies who know how to cook, the ladies who are, as we call it in Balabusta, right, ladies, those Balabusta girls, they don't need any measuring cups. They do everything by hand. Because they're professionals, they're experienced, they're bubbies, whatever, right? Those ladies who know how to run the house properly. They don't need any measuring cups or anything like that, they just everything with their hands. So that's fine, be my guest, right? No problem with that. So as we said, right, but he says the baker can do it, right, to measure. The baker. So why is that? Because he says, if he's doing it for the purpose that, it shouldn't become spoiled or whatever, or get burned or something, get damaged, the food. So he's allowed to measure for that purpose, right? So we'll see how the Bet Yosef explains that. It's very interesting. Let's see what he says. Right, here we go. So it says Bet Yosef, he brings a source for this, right? Perek and Sadin over there in Betzah, Kaftet Amud Aleph, Hanachtom moded tavlin benoten letoch hakdera. Right, so he says the nachtom, which is the baker, right? Which means like probably the chef, here, right? More the chef is allowed to measure his spices and put it into the food, right? Whatever. Why is that? Because it can damage the dish, right? It can get burned or whatever, damaged, so therefore, right, he's allowed to do it. ומשמע לכאורה שלא התירו אלא לנחתום דווקא שלא יישאר כל אדם וכדברי רבנו אבל הרב מגיד כתב. But it says, implies from this, right, says Bet Yosef, that from when it comes to a layman, right, in your house, we don't allow that, right? Only professional chef, or baker, or whatever the kinds of things like this, right? A person who's doing a large scale. Professional. Okay, so that we do allow. אבל הרב מגיד, says הרב מגיד, כתב פרק ד' דלאו דווקא נחתום, אלא הוא הדין לכל אדם, אלא שדיברו החכמים בהווה. So this rabbi says something interesting, right? He says, it's not really only a chef or a baker. Anybody can do this. וכתב שכן, נראה מדברי קצת גאונים. He says some of the Geonim also said that. So, okay, that's interesting. So in other words, what he's trying to say, this rabbi is like this, right? That when they said, regarding the baker or the chef, right, whatever, that it's allowed, it applies to anybody who is doing it for the purpose of the dish not getting burned or whatever, or getting damaged, he's allowed to do that. If that's his purpose. Okay, let's see Shulchan Aruch and we'll see what the halacha is, right? We're done. We're done. So it says, right, like this, Mutar adam limdod tavlin liten b'kdera b'shvil shelo k'diach tefshilo, right? So he paskins like this opinion, right? We just saw here. That what? That anybody can do this, right? If his purpose is that what? That, his dish shouldn't get burned or damaged. If that's your purpose, anybody can do it. Doesn't matter whether you're a chef or you're a layman, right? Or whatever, right? Whatever you are. So it explains here in the parentheses, Shelo yisafu b'kalkelenum mechamed rebut tavlin. So it says, right? Interesting. I didn't know this, by the way. The ladies probably know better than me. For sure they know better than me. Right? No question about it. It says, right? What does this mean here? What is it talking about? That it says when you put sometimes too much spice, the food gets burned. I didn't know that. Is that true, by the way? Yeah, it must be true, right? If they say so, it must be true. Yeah. That's very interesting. So when you overspice something, it can burn the dish, Boom. So if that's your purpose, you can measure. Why is that, by the way? Because if that's your purpose, well, you need that to cook, That's the bottom line, right? You need it. There's no alternative. You don't have an alternative method. So therefore, it's allowed. Okay, very good. We're done with the chapter. Thank God. Baruch Hashem. Okay, thanks for coming back. Right, we were on a one-day hiatus because of my the procedure, and now Baruch Hashem, we should go on without any more delays, right? Without any more gaps in our learning. B'ezrat Hashem. Okay, Chazak Baruch, Laila Tov. We'll see you tomorrow. B'ezrat Hashem. God bless.
Kavod harav, thank you so much.
All the blessings. Bye bye.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too.